If you're interviewing for a job, it is likely you're going to be asked a question about thinking out of the box. And this qualifies as, well, thinking big. And while you might think that, well, the role or the job or the experience that you've had in the past doesn't really require you to think out of the box, that's probably not true. And we're going to walk through what it means to think big in an interview. Welcome back to Interview Out, where our mission is to help 100,000 people land their dream job. As a reminder, we teach the use of the Amazon leadership principles because they serve as a fantastic categorization framework for the experiences that you've had in your career. We use the Amazon leadership principles because it does not matter the role or the company that you're targeting. If you use the structures that we talk about in these videos, you will show up better than most of the candidates who are interviewing for the role you're targeting. In the last video, we covered ownership because at guessthelp.com, that was by far the number one give up leadership principle for most of the customers of that site. Looks like I spoke too soon. Over the last couple weeks, there are two leadership principles which have rocketed to the top of the I give up leaderboard. Frugality, which I won't cover today because I can only afford to do one video, and think big, which now sits squarely atop at what we will call the most misunderstood of the leadership principles. Don't forget, the role of the interview itself is to establish whether or not you can do that role at that company and likely exceed expectations that they have for anybody that they're going to bring into the company for that position. So when you're dealing with the interviews that are tossing out the behavioral interview questions, it's critical that you understand the question behind the question. If you can identify the leadership principle, whether or not they understand that they're assigning it to a leadership principle, you can better prepare your stories and be more organized in your preparation. So what is Think Big? Well, here it is in the words of the Amazon Leadership Principles posted on their website. Thinking small is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Leaders create and communicate a bold direction that inspires results. They think differently and look around the corners for ways to serve customers. It's important not to get hung up on the language in these leadership principles because sometimes you'll see the word leader and think, well, I've never managed anybody, so I'm not a leader, so it doesn't apply to me. And that couldn't be more untrue. Essentially, you'd both be right and wrong. You're not a leader not because you didn't manage anybody. You're not a leader because, well, you have the wrong mindset. A lot of the customers from my videos tend to be individuals looking for roles in the tech space. And while these lessons are broadly applicable to just about anybody, when I cover the leadership principles here, I am going to target the roles that exist inside of tech companies. So how does Think Big apply to a product manager? Well, not as much as you would think. The reality is more often than not, PMs need to demonstrate Invent and Simplify more than Think Big. Think Big will get covered by Invent and Simplify, but really, unless you're really like a senior leader or a chief product officer or something like that, really the role of the product manager is to invent and simplify, right? You got to solve the customer problems that are in front of you and go and execute. So it's a gentle dance, and sometimes you've got to push pull, but this is one of those where if I was interviewing product managers for roles in any of my companies, I'm more looking for Invent and Simplify than I am Think Big. Next up is engineers. Well, this is pretty important for them, especially for the more senior engineers, architects, principal levels and above, because they're basically designing huge, unwieldy, unmanageable systems that, well, they have to be able to think big, maintain that all in their mind, and figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't crater the company, right, from a maintenance point of view and a code maintainability point of view, but also solves customer problems in an efficient way. Program managers. You know, this one's going to probably generate a lot of heat because I personally don't think program managers need to worry about Think Big because in general, and this depends on how you use program managers inside your organization, program managers are more concerned with the, less with the what and the why and more in the how and the when. But the how and the when is more aligned with the orchestration of a bunch of moving parts to get things delivered on time and not the how, like, oh, how do we solve this really hard problem? It's more like, how do we get a bunch of our human capital resources to get this stuff done? And so thinking big is a lot less important for that specific role type. What about BizDev, partnerships, solutions, that sort of thing? Well, sort of. When you're trying to develop new partnerships, you're trying to get creative about the ways in which you're going to interact with new third parties and companies that you want to work with. Yeah, sometimes you got to get creative, but it's not a critical factor for this type of role. Last up, marketing. The hard part about doing the role of marketing is being able to look around the corners and understand what customers don't really think they need, but then communicating to them that you've got this thing that solves their problem in a way that they hadn't thought of solving before. As someone who served in marketing capacities at previous points in my career, I understand the heat that we get from the technical folks who seem to think that marketing is kind of a fluffy exercise and it's really not necessary, but some of the greatest marketing minds were also technical in nature. Think about Steve Jobs, great marketing mind. He did a lot of great things for the tech industry, and we can argue some of the other things that he did for the tech industry, but for the most part, he was very good at communicating things that you didn't know you needed and convincing you that you needed them. And so if I was to take an example outside of tech, think about the person who's responsible for marketing the zipper. The zipper. It's a completely mundane and boring thing that we look at now and go, of course, the zipper. It makes a lot of sense for pants. But the reality is, before the zipper existed, you had buttons on pants. And we're going to talk about interlocking metal teeth next to your groin, because that's how an engineer would have described it, not how a marketing person would have described it. So yeah, you have to think big. So what do you, as a candidate, need to do to demonstrate that you are, in fact, thinking big when you're communicating stories in your interview? When looking at the stories that you're trying to use for demonstrating that you think big, ask yourself if you're demonstrating any one of these three things. 1, are you continually asking questions to get a sense of the short and the long-term goals of the company, the group, the whatever, to assess whether or not they're going to impact the work that you're doing? Are you demonstrating that you have the ability to translate the broader mission goals and ideas into the tactical work that you need to do and execute against on a day-to-day? And you consistently accept the implicit challenge to create great ideas or take on great risks with your work? Additionally, if you're a people manager, you might also want to consider thinking about these additional items as you craft your stories and talk about your people management experience or when you're running teams. Have you been able to demonstrate that you create big, hairy, audacious goals or missions that employees can be inspired by and need to get behind? Really important, and oftentimes this doesn't come through in the stories that I hear in doing the mock interviews, is whether or not you are continually communicating the big picture, right? And the big picture and the mission to the team in a manner that gets everybody excited. Are you constantly communicating to keep everybody in your team extended, otherwise everybody aligned to the same goals? If you would also like to have a free mock interview or use any of the tools that we're making available at interviewat.com, please visit, have a look, see if there's something there for you, but really we are trying to make it easier for you to land your dream job. As you're preparing your stories, there's a couple of steps that you're really going to want to make sure that you consider. And step one, obviously, is selecting the right LP. And in this case, it's think big. But in step two, you want to select a North Star question, which is going to help guide your story development, right? This is going to help keep you on track as you work through step three. For the purposes of this walkthrough, I'm going to use a common think big question to help illustrate step three and kind of walk through it. And that question is, tell me about a time you were working on an initiative or a goal and saw an opportunity to do something much bigger than the original plan. Now that you've got your leadership principle identified and the question that you're going to use is your North Star, we're going to break up your story development into three phases: the beginning, the middle, and the end. And I always use a star format. Why? Because it forces linear storytelling, and it's a much easier way to think about communicating your story in a way that encourages conversation in the interview, but also make sure that you cover all the ground that's necessary to communicate, well, all the information you need to communicate to demonstrate that you know how to do this thing. The framework that I develop and talk about on this channel for easing your story development is to use the FAQ format for your STAR answers. For each of the three sections, situation, task, action, result, come up with a list of FAQ questions that you absolutely need to answer to effectively communicate what you've done, but not overload the answer. In general, you're going to want between 5 and 8 FAQ questions that you answer per section. Because again, you're trying to limit how much time you speak. You don't want to speak on and on and on and on, right? You have to be concise, and the answers should be only as long as they need to be and not one word longer. So while I'm going to walk through 5 questions here that I would use as part of my story development, these aren't hard and fast rules, right? These are the 5 that I came up with for this question. There might be 6th, the 7th, and 8th. It's not a hard and fast rule, but this is meant to help guide you in how to think about using the FAQ format for your story development. Question 1, what was your role at the time? This is really important. A lot of people don't cover this, and it's super important. If you're going to talk about doing a bigger thing, you got to be clear about what your role was at the time. Question 2, on what project were you working? Seems obvious to talk about this, but a lot of people will just say, well, I was working as a marketing manager at such and such company, and we were trying to do customer development or something, right? They're not very specific. So be very clear about what project you were working on. Because this question is focused on doing something bigger than the original goal, you're going to want to come up front in the situation task portion with, question 3, how are you going to measure the success of your work? Once you've outlined how you're going to measure the success of your work, question 4 would be, in what way did you feel like you could improve on that measure, right? Because you're trying to establish there was a goal, we saw an opportunity to do something bigger. Well, how are you going to measure that? And question 5, this is a critical one, right? Because if you're talking to your boss about, hey, I did this awesome stuff, pay me more, or I'm awesome, promote me, or whatever, a clear and obvious question in the situation task kind of phase of the answer would be, well, why did you feel it was important to address this issue at this time? Listen, if you're getting value out of this content, I would love it if you just click like, below, subscribe. All of that is really great. Question I get asked all the time is, why don't I have more viewers? And I actually thought, I'm getting close to 2,000. I feel pretty good about that, but there's certainly other channels that have more. I don't know. Maybe the algorithm doesn't like me yet. I haven't been discovered, but maybe it has to do with how often you guys are clicking like or how often you're leaving comments. I love getting the questions in the comments. Please go ahead and leave them down below. I promise I'll respond because honestly, I love helping people. Okay, now we're moving on to the action phase. And this is really where, well, a lot of the action happens. And you're gonna wanna cover what you did and explain how it expanded beyond doing the original goal, right? How you saw the opportunity for something bigger and you actually got there. So question 1, what change did you make in your course of action, right? Because with situation task, you kind of laid out what you were doing in the direction you're going. This is where you get to talk about, well, and here's how we changed, right? We saw a bigger opportunity and here's what we changed to get there. Critical to that discussion of the change in course of action is going to be question 2, which is, well, what was the delta that you anticipated in terms of the original goal and your new goal, right? What did you hope was going to happen? What was the plan? Question 3, did you seek feedback, consultation from anybody else in the team, in the organization, across the organization, right? But did you talk to anybody else about this to really understand what it was you're going to do and the potential knock-on effects, or maybe even bigger, right? Because it's not enough to simply say, well, I saw a bigger plan and I was going to go do X. But if you have the ability to layer in, well, by working with other folks on the team and I added this and they added that, we saw an even bigger, that's awesome, right? You can add that in, and this question helps drive that point. Question 4, and this is one of my favorites. What course of action did you consider and reject? Now, you talk about one thing, you talk about multiple things, but what else did you consider as part of this and you decided we didn't do it, and why? And finally, question 5, what was the timeline impact for this course of action change, right? How is it going to affect the schedule, right? It's not enough to simply say, oh, I saw an idea for something bigger, and oh, by the way, it projected out the schedule another 2 years, but we did it anyway because we didn't think about the impact to customers. That would be obviously very bad. So you have to know ahead of time, hey, we're going to do this thing, and then we're going to weigh some decisions around, well, it's going to add this much time, or maybe it reduces time, but it's going to add this much time, but we get this much more benefit. So when you think about it, it makes sense. You're going to want to be able to convey that you understood that going into what it was you were doing. And finally, the third part, the end of your story, right? The results. Right? Question 1, how did the performance actually change? What did it actually do, right? You had your plans and you knew what you were trying to do. How did it actually do? Did you overperform? Did you come in under your expectations but still did more than what you thought? All of that is fine and good, but you have to be able to talk to it. Question 2, and this is more of a ability to demonstrate that you're introspective or that you can look back on the work that you've done, right? And kind of think critically about it. But question 2, what additional metrics could you cite that indicate that this was a good decision, right? Because you kind of talked about, well, here's how we were measuring success, but now looking back, what else could you talk about that show and clearly demonstrate this was a successful outcome? Question 3, and this is another one that kind of demonstrates the ability to look back retrospectively and have that introspection about, well, did I make the right decision? So question 3, were there additional trade-offs that you could have made to improve this even more? Question 4, and why this largely could apply to people managers. It could definitely apply to an individual contributor who has the ability to look around their team, but what was the main lesson learned by the team as a result of this change in direction, right? What did they take away from it? What did you learn? What did you understand? What did you apply to future projects? But that's a good way to kind of demonstrate it wasn't just a one-time thing. We saw a bigger opportunity. We did some things. We learned some stuff, and here's how we applied it to future work. And finally, question 5, and this likely will come from a really good interviewer if you don't provide this information, right? If they're doing their job, but it's looking back on this now. Do you think it would have been possible to achieve the same result with a different course of action, right? Because with the benefit of hindsight, right? Hindsight's always 20/20, but also new experiences and you're leveling up. Can you look back on what you did and say, you know what, we probably could have done that with half the resources, and here's how, and we know that now? That's fine. That shows that you're growing, shows that you're learning, and that's awesome. With these 15 baseline questions, you are on your way to crafting a great star format answer for any question targeting the Think Big leadership principle.